Ed Sullivan looked directly at Miles Davis and said the words that were supposed to destroy his career on live television. "You're not playing trumpet tonight, you're playing piano, and you're playing what we tell you to play." What happened next in front of 50 million viewers made television history. It was March 15th, 1958, and The Ed Sullivan Show was the most powerful platform in American entertainment. One appearance could launch a career to stratospheric heights or destroy it completely. For jazz musicians, getting booked on Sullivan's show was the ultimate validation. It meant your music had crossed over from the smoky clubs to mainstream America's living rooms. Miles Davis had been booked to appear as part of a Jazz Night in America special segment. At 31 years old, Miles was already being hailed as one of the most innovative trumpet players in the world, but he was also gaining a reputation for being difficult, uncompromising, and unwilling to play by the entertainment industry's unwritten rules. That reputation was exactly what had Ed Sullivan worried. 3 weeks before the show, Sullivan had attended a Miles Davis performance at Birdland in New York City. What he'd witnessed that night had both impressed and alarmed him. Miles had completely ignored the audience, playing with his back turned to the crowd for most of the set. He'd refused to announce song titles, barely acknowledged the applause, and had walked off stage without so much as a thank you. "He's talented," Sullivan had told his producers after the show, "but he's got no respect for the audience. On my show, we do things differently." Sullivan's show had built its success on performers who understood their role: smile for the camera, wave to the audience, make people feel comfortable in their homes. Jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald had mastered this balance, delivering brilliant music while maintaining the warmth and accessibility that television demanded. Miles Davis was different, and Sullivan knew it. The plan that Sullivan and his head producer Mario Lewis devised was intended to teach Miles a lesson about respect and humility. It was also designed to humiliate him in a way that would serve as a warning to other difficult artists. The setup was elaborate and cruel. On the morning of the show, Miles arrived at CBS Studio 50 for his scheduled rehearsal, carrying his trumpet case and wearing his typical understated elegance, a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to armor him against the world's expectations. He was expecting to run through his planned set, a version of Autumn Leaves and his own composition Walkin'. Instead, he found Ed Sullivan waiting for him on the empty stage, flanked by 2 network executives and Mario Lewis. "Miles," Sullivan said, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone that introduced acts to millions of Americans every Sunday night, "we need to talk." Miles set down his trumpet case and looked at Sullivan with the steady, unflinching gaze that had become his trademark. He said nothing, waiting. "Your trumpet playing is fine," Sullivan continued, "but tonight we want you to show America something different. We want you to play piano." Miles's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled his rising anger. "I'm a trumpet player," Miles said quietly. "That's what you booked." Sullivan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Well, tonight you're a piano player. The audience needs to see that jazz musicians are versatile, that they're not just limited to one instrument. It'll be good for your image." What Sullivan didn't say, what he couldn't say, on television in 1958, was the real reason behind the change. The network executives were nervous about putting a black musician on stage with a trumpet, an instrument that required Miles to stand tall and command attention. A piano would keep him seated, contained, less threatening to the white suburban families who made up the majority of Sullivan's audience. Miles understood exactly what was happening. "And if I refuse?" Miles asked. Mario Lewis stepped forward. "Then you don't perform tonight, and you don't get paid. And everyone in the business knows you walked out on Ed Sullivan." It was a perfect trap. Refusing would label Miles as unprofessional and difficult to work with, potentially destroying his chances of reaching mainstream audiences. But agreeing would mean submitting to a deliberate humiliation designed to diminish his stature as an artist. Miles looked at the piano that had been wheeled onto the stage, an old upright that looked like it had been pulled from a rehearsal room. This wasn't even the show's main performance piano. It was deliberately shabby, another layer of the intended insult. "What do you want me to play?" Miles asked. Sullivan's smile widened. "Something the audience can relate to. Maybe some standards. Moon River would be nice. Keep it simple. Keep it sweet." Miles nodded slowly, and Sullivan and his team exchanged satisfied glances. They thought they had broken him. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. What Ed Sullivan and his producers didn't know was that Miles Davis was not just one of the world's greatest trumpet players. He was also a classically trained pianist who had studied at Juilliard. Piano had been his first instrument, the foundation of his musical education, but he rarely performed on it publicly, because he preferred the expressive power of the trumpet. More importantly, they didn't understand that Miles Davis had never in his entire career backed down from a challenge. That evening, as the studio audience filled the theater and millions of American families settled in front of their television sets, Miles Davis sat backstage contemplating the most important performance of his career. He wasn't just playing for the audience, he was playing for every jazz musician who had ever been told to compromise their art for commercial acceptance. When Ed Sullivan walked out to introduce the segment, his confidence was complete. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the cameras, "jazz music is often seen as complicated and inaccessible, but tonight we're going to show you a different side of this American art form. Please welcome one of jazz's rising stars, Miles Davis, who tonight will be performing on piano." The studio audience applauded politely as Miles walked out onto the stage. He was impeccably dressed as always, but his expression was unreadable as he approached the old upright piano. The camera captured him, settling onto the bench, adjusting his position and placing his hands on the keys. For a moment, there was complete silence in the studio. Then Miles began to play. What emerged from that shabby upright piano was not Moon River or any other safe standard that Sullivan had requested. Instead, Miles began with Bach's Goldberg variations, playing with a precision and classical beauty that stunned everyone in the studio. The studio audience, who had expected simple, accessible jazz, found themselves listening to one of the most complex and sophisticated pieces in the classical repertoire, performed flawlessly by someone they had assumed was just another jazz musician. But Miles was just getting started. Without pause, he transitioned from Bach into a slow, haunting version of Autumn Leaves, but this wasn't the gentle standard that nightclub audiences knew. This was a complete reimagining of the song, with complex harmonies and rhythmic innovations that turned a simple melody into something profound and moving. The camera operators, who had been instructed to keep their shots tight and controlled, found themselves instinctively pulling back to capture Miles's hands as they moved across the keyboard with impossible grace and precision. In the control room, Ed Sullivan watched in growing amazement and horror as his plan to humiliate Miles Davis completely backfired. The phone lines at the network were already lighting up with viewers calling to ask who this incredible piano player was. But Miles still wasn't finished. For his final number, he began playing his own composition, Walkin', but arranged for solo piano in a way that had never been heard before. The piece showcased not just his technical skill, but his innovative approach to jazz harmony and rhythm. He was essentially creating a new form of jazz piano performance in real time, live on television. As Miles played, something unprecedented began happening in the studio audience. These were regular television viewers, not jazz aficionados, but they were completely mesmerized by what they were hearing. Several people were visibly moved to tears by the beauty and power of the music. When Miles finished his final song, the studio was completely silent for several seconds. Then the audience erupted in the most sustained applause that the Ed Sullivan Show had received all season. Miles stood up from the piano bench, nodded once to the audience, and walked off stage without saying a word. He had said everything he needed to say with his music. Backstage, Ed Sullivan was waiting for him. But the dynamic had completely shifted. Sullivan was no longer the powerful television mogul calling the shots. He was a man who had just witnessed something extraordinary and knew he had been part of creating it. "Miles," Sullivan said, "that was incredible." Miles looked at him with that same steady gaze. "Did I play what you wanted me to play?" Sullivan paused, understanding that Miles was asking about much more than song selection. "You played exactly what you should have played." The impact of Miles's performance was immediate and far-reaching. The network switchboard was flooded with calls from viewers asking about the pianist they had just discovered. Record stores reported a run on Miles Davis albums the next day, with many customers specifically asking if he had any piano recordings. More importantly, the performance changed how jazz was presented on television. Other variety shows began booking jazz musicians specifically to showcase their versatility and artistry rather than just their entertainment value. Miles had proven that television audiences were hungry for sophisticated music if it was presented with integrity and skill. The performance also changed Miles's own career trajectory. While he continued to be primarily known as a trumpet player, he began incorporating more piano into his studio recordings and live performances. The confidence he gained from conquering the Ed Sullivan Show's challenge emboldened him to take even greater artistic risks in the years that followed. Within the jazz community, the story of Miles's Sullivan Show appearance became legendary. Musicians would tell and retell the story of how Miles had turned a deliberate humiliation into a triumph, using his hidden skills to defeat those who had underestimated him. Years later, when asked about that night, Miles would say, "They thought they could make me smaller by putting me behind a piano instead of letting me stand up with my trumpet. They didn't understand that great music doesn't depend on the instrument. It depends on the musician." Ed Sullivan, to his credit, learned from the experience. He continued to book jazz musicians on his show, but with a new respect for their artistry and intelligence. He never again attempted to dictate how a musician should present their art. The footage of Miles's performance became one of the most requested clips in the Sullivan Show archives. Music schools used it to teach students about the importance of being prepared for any musical challenge. Piano students studied Miles's technique, while jazz historians analyzed how he had revolutionized the presentation of jazz on television. But perhaps the most important legacy of that night was the message it sent to artists everywhere: that talent, preparation, and integrity could overcome even the most deliberate attempts at humiliation. Miles Davis had walked into CBS Studio 50 that night as a trumpet player who had been forced to play piano. He walked out as something much more powerful. An artist who had proven that true greatness cannot be diminished by the prejudices and limitations of others. The performance also demonstrated something profound about the nature of artistic skill. Miles's ability to excel at piano didn't diminish his trumpet playing, it enhanced it, showing the depth of his musical understanding and the breadth of his capabilities. In interviews years later, Miles would often be asked about the secret to handling adversity in the music business. His answer was always the same: be so good at what you do that they can't ignore you, no matter how hard they try. The night that Ed Sullivan tried to humiliate Miles Davis instead became the night that Miles Davis proved that real artistry cannot be contained, controlled, or diminished by those who fail to understand it. Today, that performance stands as a testament to the power of turning obstacles into opportunities, of using challenges as chances to reveal hidden strengths, and of maintaining dignity in the face of those who would try to tear you down. If this incredible story of artistic triumph over adversity moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of turning challenges into victories. Have you ever had to prove yourself in an unexpected way? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more amazing stories about the legends who changed music history forever.